Gather around, my friends, for what I'm about to tell you is not just a story, but a bone-chilling tale that has haunted the minds of those who dare to remember it. It was a cold, misty, Halloween night in the year 1998, when four friends, John, Emily, David, and Sarah, decided to venture into the heart of darkness itself, the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. They had heard the whispers, the rumors, the tales of unspeakable horrors that had transpired within those crumbling walls. But in their youthful arrogance, they dismissed them as nothing more than ghost stories told to scare children. The asylum had been closed for over 50 years, and its history was shrouded in mystery. Some said that the doctors who worked there were conducting cruel experiments on the patients, treating them like lab rats rather than human beings. Others claimed that the patients were driven mad by the very place that was supposed to cure them, that the walls themselves had absorbed the screams and suffering of those trapped inside, and that the spirits of the tormented still roamed the halls, seeking vengeance on anyone who dared to enter. The group arrived at the asylum just as the last light of day slipped beneath the horizon, leaving the world in darkness. The building loomed before them like a beast from a nightmare, its windows shattered, its roof caved in, and its walls covered in a thick layer of moss and ivy. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the cold wind. "Are you sure about this?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. John, the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish of the group, laughed. "Come on, Em, it's just an old building. What's there to be afraid of?" David, always the practical one, frowned. "There's something off about this place. Maybe we should just go back." But Sarah, ever eager for a thrill, shook her head. "We came all this way, didn't we? Let's at least take a look inside." With a deep breath, they pushed open the heavy iron gates and made their way up the overgrown path to the entrance. The massive wooden doors creaked ominously as they forced them open, revealing a dark, yawning void within. Their flashlights pierced the darkness, revealing a long, narrow hallway lined with rusted metal doors. The air inside was musty and oppressive, as if the building itself was breathing, watching, waiting. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they ventured deeper into the asylum. Every step echoed through the empty corridors, magnifying their fear. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and the remnants of old furniture lay scattered about, as if the inhabitants had left in a hurry. The further they went, the colder it became, and soon they could see their breath in the air. "This place is creepy as hell," David muttered, glancing nervously around. "Let's just take a quick look and get out of here." But as they reached the end of the hallway, something strange happened. The temperature dropped suddenly, and they felt a heavy, oppressive presence all around them, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. Emily gasped and clutched John's arm. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" John asked, trying to sound brave, though his voice betrayed him. It sounded like someone whispering. They all stopped and listened, their hearts pounding in their chests. At first there was nothing but silence, and then they heard it, a faint, indistinct whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It was coming from the darkness ahead, from the depths of the asylum. Sarah's eyes widened in fear, but she forced herself to speak. "Maybe it's just the wind." But the whisper grew louder, more distinct, and now they could make out words that chilled them to the bone. "Help us. Help us." The voice was filled with pain, with despair, and it was coming from just beyond the next door. Without thinking, John reached out and pushed the door open, revealing a large, empty room. The walls were lined with old, rusty beds, their mattresses stained with dark, dried blood. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was covered in debris and broken glass. But what caught their attention most was the figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered, blood-stained hospital gown. Her hair was matted and filthy, and her eyes were hollow, empty sockets, black as night. She stood there, motionless, staring at them with a gaze that seemed to pierce their very souls. Emily screamed, and the others took a step back in horror. But the woman did not move. She just stood there, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to speak. But no sound came out. The whispering they had heard was still there, but it was all around them now, echoing off the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. John's hands shook as he raised his flashlight higher, illuminating more of the room. And that's when they saw them, the other figures. They were scattered around the room, lying on the beds, standing in the corners, all of them dressed in the same tattered gowns, all of them with the same hollow, empty eyes. And all of them were staring at the group with expressions of agony and torment, their mouths moving in silent pleas for help. "Let's get out of here," David shouted, panic rising in his voice. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, plunging them into darkness. The flashlights flickered and died, leaving them in pitch black. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, more frantic. "Help us, God, please. Don't leave us." The air grew colder still, and the walls seemed to close in around them. They could feel the spirits pressing in on them, their cold, bony fingers brushing against their skin, pulling at their clothes, tugging them deeper into the darkness. John fumbled for the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the spirits themselves were holding it shut, trapping them inside. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room was silent, the air thick with an unbearable tension. And in that silence they heard something else, a low, guttural growl coming from the far side of the room. Slowly, hesitantly, they turned to look, and what they saw froze them in their tracks. In the corner of the room, where the first woman had been standing, there was now a shadow. It was darker than the darkness itself, a void that seemed to suck in all light, all warmth, all hope. And from within that shadow, two glowing red eyes stared back at them, filled with malice, with hunger. The growl grew louder, deeper, as the shadow began to move toward them, creeping along the floor like a living thing. The spirits in the room began to wail, their cries of agony filling the air, and the group felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over them. "We need to get out of here now," Sarah screamed, her voice shaking with terror. They turned and began to pound on the door, desperate to escape. But the door held firm, the spirit's grip on it unyielding. The shadow drew closer, its growl reverberating through their bones, its eyes fixed on them with a malevolent hunger. In a final act of desperation, John threw his shoulder against the door with all his strength, and with a splintering crash, it burst open. They tumbled out into the hallway, scrambling to their feet, and ran as fast as they could, their footsteps echoing through the asylum as they fled from the horrors within. They didn't stop running until they were outside, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. The cold night air hit them like a slap to the face, but they didn't care. They were alive. They had escaped. Or so they thought. As they caught their breath, they realized something was wrong. The whispering, it hadn't stopped. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was still there, lingering in the back of their minds, like a dark, malevolent presence that had followed them out of the asylum. And then they heard it, a soft, cold breath on the back of their necks, a whisper in their ears. "You cannot escape. You belong to us now." They turned to look at each other, and what they saw made their blood run cold. Their faces. They were changing. Dark circles formed under their eyes. Their skin turned pale and cold, and their eyes began to hollow, just like the spirits they had seen inside. In that moment, they knew the truth. They had not escaped the asylum. They had become a part of it, trapped in a never-ending nightmare, their souls claimed by the darkness that dwelled within its walls. And as they faded into the night, their screams echoed through the empty halls of the asylum, joining the chorus of the damned forever lost in the shadows of that cursed place. It was a night like no other, a night where the air was heavy with the scent of decaying leaves, where the wind whispered secrets through the skeletal branches of trees, and where the veil between the living and the dead grew perilously thin. Halloween in our small, forgotten town always carried an unsettling weight, a dark history that lingered like a curse. But there was one place, one story, that even the bravest souls dared not speak of aloud. The hollow tree at the edge of the forest. The tree stood ancient and gnarled, its trunk twisted and hollowed out as if time itself had tried to rip out its very heart. Generations had passed down tales of the tree being cursed, haunted by the spirit of a young girl who had vanished without a trace on Halloween night many years ago. Some said she had wandered too deep into the forest, lured by a voice that called to her from the shadows. Others believed she had been taken, snatched by something that dwelled within the tree itself. No one knew for sure what had happened to her, but everyone knew the legend. And every Halloween, as darkness fell and the world turned its gaze away from the horrors that lurked in the night, the ghost of the girl was said to appear by the hollow tree, searching for the one thing that had been lost to her, her beloved doll. It was on such a night where the moon hung low and the stars hid behind thick clouds, that a group of reckless teenagers, believing themselves immune to the fear that gripped the town, decided to confront the legend head-on. They had heard the stories, of course, but they scoffed at the warnings, laughing in the face of what they called old wives' tales. They were young, and youth often carries with it the arrogance of invincibility. The group gathered at the edge of the forest just before midnight, their breath visible in the chill autumn air. They brought with them flashlights, blankets, and enough bravado to mask the flicker of fear in their eyes. As they stepped into the darkness of the woods, the world around them seemed to grow quieter, the usual sounds of night creatures falling into an eerie silence. The hollow tree wasn't far, but the journey felt interminable, the shadows of the trees closing in around them, as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep them from their destination. But finally they saw it, the twisted silhouette of the tree, rising out of the ground like some monstrous claw reaching for the heavens. They set up camp a short distance from the tree, laughing and joking to keep the tension at bay. But as the clock struck midnight, a cold wind swept through the clearing, and the air grew thick with an unnatural stillness. The teenagers fell silent, their eyes drawn to the hollow tree. It was then that they saw her. At first, she was just a faint outline, barely visible against the darkness. But as their eyes adjusted, they saw her clearly. A young girl, no older than 7 or 8, standing by the tree. She wore a white dress, tattered and dirt-stained, and her hair hung in limp strands around her pale face. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to devour the light from their flashlights. She was crying, a soft, pitiful sound that echoed through the clearing. In her hands she clutched something tightly, something that the group soon realized was an old, tattered doll. It was missing an eye, its dress torn, but the girl held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. One of the teenagers, a boy named Jack, was the first to move. He stepped forward, his bravado crumbling in the face of the apparition before him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Do you need help?" The girl didn't respond. She simply looked up at him with those empty eyes, and in that moment, Jack felt a chill so deep it seemed to freeze his very soul. He wanted to turn back, to run, but something compelled him to keep moving forward. He reached out to touch her, to offer some comfort, but as his hand got closer, the girl's expression changed. Her sad, tear-streaked face twisted into something else, something dark and malevolent. She opened her mouth, and from her throat came a sound that was not of this world, a guttural, inhuman scream that reverberated through the trees. The others watched in horror as Jack's hand passed right through her. The girl began to fade, dissolving into the air like mist. But just before she vanished completely, she whispered something, a single word that none of them could quite make out, but that filled them with a dread so profound it left them paralyzed. When she was gone, the group stood in stunned silence, the only sound, the rapid beating of their hearts. The warmth had left the air entirely, replaced by an icy cold that bit at their skin. It was as if the girl had taken all the warmth, all the life with her when she disappeared. Jack turned back to his friends, his face ashen. "We need to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, too shaken to argue. They gathered their things as quickly as they could, but as they turned to leave, they noticed something at the base of the tree, something they hadn't seen before. It was a doll, an old, dusty doll that looked exactly like the one the ghost had been holding. It lay there, nestled among the roots of the hollow tree, as if it had been waiting for them. No one dared to touch it. They simply stared at it, fear tightening around their throats like a noose. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they turned and fled, not daring to look back. The next day, the townsfolk found the doll still lying at the base of the tree. No one knew where it had come from, but they didn't question it. The legend of the hollow tree was known too well, and they understood that some things were best left undisturbed. The teenagers never spoke of that night again. They carried the memory with them, a shadow that haunted their dreams and cast a pall over their waking lives. And every Halloween, when the wind began to howl and the shadows grew long, they would think of the girl in the white dress and the hollow, empty eyes that had looked straight through them. For the rest of their lives, they would avoid the forest, and the hollow tree would stand alone, its secrets buried deep within its twisted roots. But the legend would live on, whispered from one generation to the next, a chilling reminder that some ghosts are never truly at rest, and that the past has a way of reaching out from the darkness to claim the living. It was a cold and eerie Halloween night in 2010, the kind where the moon hung low in the sky, casting an unsettling glow on everything it touched. The wind howled through the trees, making the barren branches creak and groan like the bones of the dead. The roads were empty, as most people had wisely chosen to stay indoors, avoiding the night's chill and the unsettling feeling that always seemed to linger on Halloween. John had been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the engine his only companion on this desolate stretch of road. He was tired, eager to get home, and the thought of his warm bed was the only thing keeping him focused. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, the road winding through dark forests that seemed to close in around him as he drove. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Midnight had just passed. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught something up ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road. John squinted, his heart skipping a beat as he realized it was a young woman, alone, with her thumb out, signaling for a ride. She was dressed in a simple white dress, the fabric fluttering in the wind, her hair hanging in loose, dark waves around her pale face. Her expression was blank, almost lifeless, but there was something in her eyes that compelled him to stop. He pulled over, the tires crunching on the gravel shoulder, and leaned over to open the passenger door. The woman silently slipped into the back seat, her movements slow and deliberate. John felt a chill run down his spine as the cold air from outside seemed to follow her into the car, lingering like a ghostly presence. "Where are you headed?" John asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed the unease he felt. The woman didn't answer. She simply nodded towards the road ahead, her eyes staring blankly at the back of his seat. Her silence was unnerving, but John brushed it off, attributing it to the late hour and the unsettling night. As he continued to drive, the atmosphere inside the car grew heavy, oppressive, like a dark cloud hanging over them. The woman remained silent, her presence almost spectral. John could feel her eyes on him, though she never seemed to move or make a sound. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional rustle of her dress and the rhythmic thud of the tires against the road. The road stretched on, winding through the forest that seemed to grow darker with every passing mile. John tried to make small talk, asking her where she was from, if she was okay, but she remained mute, her gaze fixed on something far away, something only she could see. His questions hung in the air, unanswered, dissipating like mist in the cold night. A sense of dread began to creep into John's mind, an irrational fear that he couldn't shake. The temperature inside the car had dropped noticeably, his breath now visible in the air, despite the heater blowing at full blast. The woman's silence became unbearable, her presence more unsettling by the minute. He found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white, as his heart pounded in his chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they approached a small, dilapidated house at the edge of the forest. The windows were dark, the place looked abandoned, but the woman leaned forward slightly, indicating this was her stop. John pulled into the driveway, the car coming to a halt in front of the old house. "We're here," he said, his voice barely a whisper as he turned to face her. But as his eyes met the back seat, his heart stopped cold. The seat was empty. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, sure that he was seeing things. But no, the back seat was vacant, as if no one had ever been there. Panic surged through him, his mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. Had she slipped out without him noticing? But that was impossible. He had heard no door open, felt no shift in the car's weight. His hands trembling, John stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at his skin. He approached the house, his footsteps hesitant, his breath coming in short, frightened gasps. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the silence, each knock a painful reminder of the fear gripping his heart. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with a tired, sorrowful expression. Her eyes, though old, were sharp, and they seemed to bore into John's soul as she studied him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy and weak, as if she had not spoken in a long time. I just gave a woman a ride," John stammered, his voice shaking. "She asked to be dropped off here, but she's gone. I don't know where she went." The old woman's face paled, her expression turning from curiosity to one of deep sorrow. She sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years of pain. "You saw her, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The girl in the white dress." John nodded, his throat too tight with fear to speak. The old woman closed her eyes as if trying to block out a painful memory. "She was my daughter," she began, her voice heavy with grief. "She died many years ago, on this very road. It was Halloween night, just like tonight. She was hit by a car while trying to hitchhike home. They say she never left, that she still haunts this road, trying to find her way back to me." John felt his blood run cold, the realization dawning on him like a nightmare made real. He had given a ride to a ghost, a restless spirit trapped between worlds, doomed to wander the road for eternity. The old woman looked at him, her eyes filled with unspeakable sadness. "Every year, on Halloween she appears, and every year, someone like you finds her, tries to bring her home, but she's already home. She just doesn't know it." John staggered back, his mind reeling, the weight of what he had experienced crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He mumbled an apology, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for, and hurried back to his car, desperate to escape the chilling reality of the night. As he drove away, the road stretching endlessly before him, he couldn't shake the image of the girl in the white dress, her hollow eyes staring at him from the darkness. The memory of her cold, silent presence lingered, a ghostly shadow that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And as the moon disappeared behind a thick blanket of clouds, plunging the road into darkness, John knew that he would never forget the Halloween night when he gave a ride to the phantom hitchhiker, a soul lost in the shadows of the past, forever searching for a way home that she could never truly find.